So welcome everyone to the Ecological Continuity Trust webinar series. Today we have Cicely Marshall speaking to us. Cicely's a research fellow in biology at King's College, Cambridge. She's a botanist and an ecologist whose research aims to improve conservation outcomes during economic development. Really interesting topic. I'm really interested in hearing more. And the work that she's presenting today is work that the Ecological Continuity Trust funded through our small grant scheme. So Cicely, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. I'm speaking today about England's implementation of biodiversity net gain, and in particular the performance of the statutory biodiversity metric that's used to calculate those losses and gains. The study, as Carly's just said, the study was funded by a small grant from the Ecological Continuity Trust, and it makes use of several ECT sites and other long-term monitoring sites across England. We published the results last year with the Journal of Applied Ecology, with my co-authors. With my co-authors. So biodiversity net gain is a system of accounting that acknowledges ongoing losses of biodiversity to development, which are compensated by biodiversity offsetting elsewhere. That's the net part of net gain. Biodiversity net gain is a policy focus worldwide. It's language that's embedded within the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Offsetting is really this final stage in the mitigation hierarchy, where predicted biodiversity impact must first be avoided, then minimized, then restored, before finally any residual negative impacts may be offset. If those offsets are designed to give an overall biodiversity gain, then it's biodiversity net gain. If it's losses, then we would call it a no net loss type of policy. So for biodiversity offsets to work for nature, then it's essential that we have a credible method to quantify those biodiversity losses and gains. And the losses that are due to an impact and the gains which are achieved through the offset must be measured in the same way, even if the habitats concerned are different, and metric has to work across habitats that are likely to be impacted by development. So that's a big ask, that's a difficult thing to do. Biodiversity can't be measured in its entirety. Most metrics that are used in offsetting programs are based on habitats, measuring habitats in some way, typically combining habitat extent with some measure of habitat quality. There are biodiversity offset metrics in use in several countries, and they all vary a bit in their calculation. In the UK then, following the introduction of the Environment Act in 2021, all new developments requiring planning permission in England must now demonstrate a 10% biodiversity net gain, calculated using this statutory biodiversity metric. The new net gain requirement is expected to generate very substantial funding for conservation. It's a devolved matter. In England, it's mandatory, but the devolved nations are following their own trajectory slightly, although subscribe to many similar principles. England's statutory metric uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity, and it scores their intrinsic distinctiveness, their current condition, and their location relative to local conservation strategies. Each of those categories carries a standard numerical value, and those are multiplied together along with the area or length of the habitat feature to calculate the number of baseline biodiversity units for all habitat features on site. Post-development then, there's a mixture of habitat creation and enhancement that's proposed by the developer, that's measured using the same statutory metric framework, and the units calculated, and there has to be at least 10% more of these units after the intervention than there were on the baseline. So what we did then, we carried out a study of this statutory metric performance, particularly the baseline statutory metric performance, working at 24 long-term monitoring sites across England, all sites that fall within Ecological Continuity Trust's remit, and some from the ECN, Environmental Change Network, and some of the LTN and Long-Term Monitoring Network sites, which is an England-wide habitat network. For each site, we calculated biodiversity units for habitat parcels during field visits, and then we correlated those biodiversity units with the existing long-term plant, bird, and butterfly species data that were already held by those sites. So we could ask whether biodiversity units were capturing elements of biodiversity value that ecologists generally recognise as important. The sites we worked at included all the terrestrial broad habitat types except for urban, and covered the full range of possible metric values. There are some important advantages of using these long-term monitoring sites in this study. Carrying out species surveys across the country is a really laborious and skilled task. So reusing those existing data allowed us to publish much faster than we would have been able to if we'd had to collect the data ourselves from, fresh. And that's important for a publication like this, which is highly policy relevant. It's something that was coming into force last year. Secondly, the data quality is very high. It's been checked and verified, vouchered, refereed the species data. So that's a specialist job. So having, being confident, being able to, to be really confident in the species level data reduces any potential noise in the data set. And thirdly, there are sites that have been set up across the country in order to represent the country well and capture to represent changes happening in the country. So that sort of thinking and planning about how to represent fairly England had been done for us to an extent. And then finally, because they're long-term data sets, we were able to take averages over 5 years of populations, for example, for birds and butterflies, which is important for those taxa where you get big interannual variations in species population sizes, for example. It's really important to make sure you're analysing patterns and trends rather than noise. So this is a map of one of our sites. This is Woodwalton Fen in Cambridgeshire. Each point is a quadrat where we have botanic data recorded, so they have quadrats, and they're 2 by 2 meters. In red is the butterfly transect route that was walked, and the black is the bird transect route. So for birds, the transects are following the breeding bird survey methods, which are these 2 parallel 1 kilometre transects. I mentioned that we've averaged over the last 5 years to be to kind of knock out some of that noise, interannual noise. And then for butterflies, the data are collected using the standard pollard walk technique from the Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, which is a sort of moving imaginary 5-metre cube. Any butterflies you encounter to walk a defined transect route. So those are our species data, and then we have to assign biodiversity units to those species data, or the other way around. So we assigned biodiversity units to the quadrats by assigning habitat type and condition to the landscape parcels or habitat parcels that those quadrats are contained in. For the bird and butterfly transects, we averaged the units of the quadrats that fell within the transects with a plus a buffer. We had a 500-meter buffer for birds or a 100-meter buffer for butterflies. Photo is my undergraduates, Isla and Christian, carrying out some of the survey work, and they wrote their projects, undergraduate projects from it. I'm a competent botanist. I'm my 5th certificate. I did a UK HAB training course, and all the surveys were done in the March to October recommended or mandated survey period. So we used those long-term species data to calculate the response variables. For plants, we used species richness, number of red-listed species, plant species range, and mean range change. That's how species have increased or decreased in range size over the last, I think it's 20 years over the Plantat data. For birds, we had 5 variables: species richness, number of individuals, number of red-listed species. We used mean population size rather than mean range size, and mean percent population change. And for butterflies, species richness, number of individuals, and red-listed species, and say mean range size again, and mean percent population change. And those are all sort of open access, freely available data sets. In some cases, government curated or government available through government data sets, identifying trends in national trends in indicators. We use generalized linear mixed models to regress those baseline biodiversity units against those single attribute proxies of biodiversity. So each point we're looking at here is either a quadrat plants or a transect for birds and butterflies. For plants, we found significant relationships between baseline units and species richness, that's panel A, and between biodiversity units and plant mean range, that's panel C, and mean range change, that's panel D. So that means that on average, plant species of higher unit habitats do have smaller ranges and have declined more over 30 years than plant species found in lower unit habitats. We ran the same analyses for birds and butterflies and found no significant relationships between units and any of richness, abundance, breadth, range, or change. So it's really encouraging that the metric does seem to be capturing differences in habitats and in the direction that we expect, at least for plants. It is, after all, a habitat metric based on plant data. But the absolute size of those changes is small, even for plants. For plant range, it's about 18 hectares difference per biodiversity unit, and the effect size is smaller for change and richness. So it seems that the metric is not capturing aspects of habitat which are important for birds and butterflies, or at least not as well as it does for plants. Why do you think that is? It might be that the habitat criteria in most cases aren't taking account of the availability of resources which are important for those taxa. So we know, for example, that floral resources, availability of floral resources is a really important predictor of insect species richness. That's not captured directly, it's sort of captured in a rather noisy way. The scale of metric calculation is important. It's less appropriate for taxa that have wider ranging individuals. We know that habitat heterogeneity and edge density are important predictors of biodiversity for mobile species, and that sort of spatial patterning of habitats is really not captured by the metric at all well. Managing connectivity, landscape connectivity is important, really important for invertebrate and bird populations. It's not. It's not captured in the statutory metric. There's been quite a lot of thought gone into how to do it in a way that is ecologically realistic but simple enough to carry out over and over again during development, and we settled on no measure. To also acknowledge that we do have fewer data points, fewer sites to put into the analysis to look for these trends for birds and butterflies. It might be that if you added another 20 sites for the birds and butterflies, the pattern might emerge. Maybe. So we made specific recommendations to improve the distinctiveness scores, condition scoring, and trading rules, habitat trading rules. The distinctiveness scores are currently based on a mix of existing designations, which mix together habitat rarity, both in the UK and in the EU, and threat. So, for example, the proportion of habitats that are represented in SSSIs, as alongside European red-listed habitats, are all kind of mixed together to come up with these, to put habitats into these 4 categories of distinctiveness. And the problem with that is that it introduces quite a lot of noise to the metric because it's not really explicit what's being measured by distinctiveness, or at least it is, but all those elements are pulling in slightly different directions. So instead, distinctiveness could be assigned using GB range size of species supported by each habitat type. That would be a very objective approach that is that isn't mixing together lots of different elements of rarity and threat. Another point is that the metric treats biodiversity as linear, with those low, medium, high, and very high distinctiveness habitats given scores of 2, 4, 6, and 8. But many natural distributions, many of the relationships we see in ecology are log linear, with disproportionate influence or tipping points at one end of a scale. So a power relationship, something like 2, 4, 8, 16, could be used to discourage destruction and incentivize creation of those higher distinctiveness habitats. On the condition scores, then they are currently derived from or taken wholesale from, in fact, the higher level agri-environment scheme farm environmental plan sheets. And the grassland sheet in particular says more about good agricultural condition than good ecological condition. For example, the undesirable species like creeping thistle and stinging nettle are penalised as undesirable species, but they are nectar-rich species and support several critically endangered native insects. So they could be, they could be revised for the next situation based on user experience with the metric. And to acknowledge also that there have been some revisions over the iterations of the metric before we reached the statutory metric. There are there's now thresholds of species richness for lower distinctiveness and higher distinctiveness grassland, for example, which are helping to tease apart those higher value grassland habitats that we sort of recognise as ecologists, but that's helpful to define it more rigorously. Another point is that at the moment, low distinctiveness habitats don't have condition scoring criteria, which has been justified on the basis that condition has a negligible effect overall on the value of low distinctiveness habitats. but our results really don't support that. So cropland, for example, our cropland samples from the Robinstead Broadbork experiment, where wheat's been grown without the application of herbicides since 1968, are the only samples from any habitat that have more than one red-listed plant species. That is admittedly a very unusual way of growing wheat in this country, but it does at least show what a high range, what a high variation in biodiversity value there is within that habitat type, and nature-friendly farming systems, organic farmers would welcome a revision to those, or yeah, some recognition of the variability in habitat condition that can be supplied by agricultural systems. Our bracken samples also have new plant species richness that are equal to that of neutral grassland, and that's at the moment one of those habitats that's not scored for condition. So are also our gardens, and we also recognise probably as ecologists that gardens can have higher or lower value for nature. On the trading rules, our results suggest that aiming for a 10% net gain would translate into negligible, small to negligible gains even for plants. The targets could be more ambitious as well as more transparent. Could align it with the 30 by 30 by 30 sort of goals. They could also be habitat specific. Against that, or to acknowledge, 10% is small, but it is positive. It is at least positive. And what came before biodiversity net gain was generally hugely negative. So, I don't know, negative net losses of hundreds, or I don't know, hundreds of percent. So that 10% is a big win in the sense that it's a positive number, and it's more than net zero. Not only is it not negative, it's not even net zero. It's positive, and that's symbolically important. Although we probably do need to go further from a nature point of view. So our conclusions then, our results suggest that a 10% net gain calculated using the current metric can be expected to translate into small gains for plant species, but not consistently for other taxa. We made some recommendations. We've met several times with Natural England and Defra to pass these on. They've been very receptive, very open. They're very, there's other researchers, or have worked with other researchers doing investigations into these metrics, and the overall sort of approach has been very positive, I would say, between a lot of dialogue between researchers and Defra and Natural England, kind of hashing this out. What England is doing with the biodiversity net gain programme is I think it's really important. It's innovative. It's a difficult thing to do. I think the potential positives are certainly there. I think other countries are looking at England to learn from the outcomes as net gain becomes established worldwide. So with that, thank you to my funders, the Ecological Continuity Trust, both for supporting the work and for having me here today. To King's College, who have supported my research for a number of years, to the data providers, and to you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions